out in the lands of danger and flame. Heroes of legend are making their name. Swords and spells with hearts full of zest. They ride with pride on a quest of interest. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Mystic lands and monsters to face. They're saving the world at a breakneck pace. From the Verdant province to Dragon's Lair, wicked wizards and trolls beware. With the rogue a knight and a mage so wise, they'll outwit danger and claim the prize. Legends told round campfire flames of secret spells and forgotten names. A hidden power, an ancient key. The fate of the realm is their destiny. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Curses, traps, and mysteries deep. No dragon's hoard is out of reach. They laugh at danger, they don't play it safe. Each wild adventure's a tale of interest. A caress. Heckfire Club, tales of interest.
We find our adventurers today having emerged victorious from the Tinker ruin, gears and loot in hand, though perhaps a little worse for wear. The air in the workshop was warm with a low mechanical hum, punctuated by the occasional hiss of pressure valves and the rhythmic clink of metal against metal. The adventurers stepped through the archway, worn from their long descent through the ruin, blood still dried at their collars and boots heavy with soot and soil. Shelbert Colborough turned at the sound of their approach and for a moment said nothing. His wide goggles reflected their forms, each of them bruised, scorched, but standing. His mouth opened slowly, and he admitted almost reverently that he was very pleased to see them alive again. He asked what they had seen, voice low, almost cautious. It wasn't curiosity, it was need. They told him everything. The trail of the kaboom crates, the twisted remains of hundreds of soul-bound constructs, shattered in heaps. They spoke of the helpy helpers, the last stand in the acid-blasted corridor, and the final desperate fight with the bendy bender, half war machine, half oddly polite engineering automaton. When they finished, Zirith stepped forward without a word and dropped a heavy sack to the floor. The impact rang with the sound of dense metal clattering on stone. The Tinker blinked and bent down, pulling open the bag with trembling hands. Inside were the MacGuffin gears, impossibly crafted pieces humming with dormant energy. He lifted them with something like awe, turning them over in his palms, examining the filigree work and etched rune marks. He turned to them, expression sobering. A deal was a deal. Zora would receive his blade, an elemental core sword, forged using the magic-laced remains of his flesh-bound gauntlet, a weapon forged from war and invention. Thomas, meanwhile, practically grinned as Shelbert confirmed the bargain. The little beetle they'd once recovered would now become a siege weapon. Friz stepped forward then, setting down another collection of items. Drop shields, fire-away canisters. She asked, with a note of caution, whether these too could be enhanced. Colborough's eyes lit up like he'd been offered the keys to every locked vault in the province. He examined the components with a joy that bordered on childish. These, he admitted, were tinker builds he'd only read about in the journals of his foremasters and cracked plate schematics. In 382 years, he had never laid hands on anything like them. The drop shields, he said, were for workplace safety. They were deployed by builders when the odd giant falling debris or skin-melting jets of steam during bendy bender-assisted construction might occur. And the fire-away were just that. They were to suppress accidental fires. Judging by the scorch marks in the Tinker's lab, the adventurers felt he may have had need of them in the past. Friz unfurled the final piece of their arrangement, the annotated map bearing the locations of more Tinkery ruins, in exchange to crack the sealed Harken Bank-coded ledgers. She reminded the tinker of his promise. At that, he let out a sharp scoff, as though the suggestion alone was offensive. A contract sworn by hand and name, he said, was not something gnomes took lightly. It would be unlocked, as agreed. Anything less would bring shame to his tools, and that was something he simply would not abide. He waved them off then, motioning toward the side chamber. Spring mattresses had been laid out, actual ones, not just pads stuffed with rags. Their frames were sturdy, their linens clean, and their placement meticulous. Behind him, the usual storm of clanking, whirling machines had gone quiet. One table, orderly, sterile, and perfectly prepared, awaited the task ahead. Every tool was placed with careful design. It was an odd bit of order in the surrounding cacophonous laboratory. They walked to the chamber in silence, scarred and exhausted. Tonight, at least, they would sleep without interruption. And as Shelbert Colborough turned back to his tools, the tinker began his work. The morning came slowly, seeping into the tinker's subterranean lab through no natural window, but through the subtle shifting of magical lanterns that dimmed as a new day began. The workshop, once buzzing with motion, now stood quiet. One by one, the adventurers stirred from their mattresses, spring-loaded and surprisingly comfortable, as promised. On the far side of the lab, nestled awkwardly between a cracked anvil and a heap of stripped cogs, Shelbert Colborough snored lightly, his head resting sideways on what looked like an improvised pillow of twine and sprockets. A wrench was tangled in his hair. His gloves, still on, were scorched and patched with fresh bandages. Around him lay the aftermath of a night's work. Burn marks, snapped bolts were embedded into the stone wall behind him, and one alchemical tube simply melted into slag. The results of his labour, however, sat proudly on the bench. The brass beetle, now encased in an angular housing of gears and vent ports, pulsing faintly. The ledgers, their once impenetrable arcane locks now open, symbols dulled. And at the centre, nestled in a copper socket lined with flickering sigils, sat the brass casing of Zora's new weapon. Friz approached the ledgers first, brushing dust from the cover and peering at the open pages. She glanced over her shoulder and asked whether Colborough had read them. He stirred just enough to scoff into the wrench beneath his face and mutter something that sounded like indignation. Reading ledgers, he mumbled, was not part of the contract. He respected privacy and paperwork equally and loathed both. Celia's eyes drifted toward the beetle-turned siege engine. She voiced the lingering question aloud. Was he certain it would work? This time the gnome sat up with effort, rubbed at his eyes, and spoke with renewed clarity. The MacGuffin gears, he explained, were as strange as they were miraculous. They could slot into any construct, no matter how foreign, and reshape themselves to perform whatever function the machine needed. In his decades of experimentation and cross-discipline crafting, he had never seen anything so adaptable. They didn't just connect. They understood. The nature of the gears remained elusive, but what he had learned in the process was beyond measure. By now he was standing, though slightly hunched, clutching his back and muttering about gnome ergonomics. He walked over to Zora with a careful gait and gestured toward the workbench. There, nestled among the devices, sat a small brass cube fitted with ridges and clasps, faintly vibrating. Colborough instructed him, channel his wild magic in his gauntlet, focus it, let it rise through his hand, and then press the cube over his palm. It would bind instantly, syncing with his arcane current and drawing from it. The sword would manifest when summoned, forged of lightning and charged air, light and weight in perfect balance. Zora grinned and reached for the cube. Then, "Wait!" barked Colborough, eyes wide behind whirring goggles. He took a swift, skittering step backward and ducked behind a reinforced steel pillar, peeking only the top of his frizzed hair around the edge. Zora paused. The others froze. Then, without further ceremony, he slammed the cube onto the gauntlet. The latches moved on their own, twisting and binding to his arm with a series of precise clicks. They cinched down, one after another, mechanical straps sliding into place as the device began to glow. Power surged through the air. Zora staggered slightly as the gauntlet flared with energy. Then, without warning, a hilt telescoped from the casing and locked into his palm. With a roar of released magic, the blade extended, crackling, thunderous, and blindingly bright. The edge shimmered between reality and force, casting deep shadows in the corners of the room. Zirath leapt backward just in time to avoid being carved in half by the freshly summoned blade. Thomas recoiled, the hair on his arms standing on end. The sword was alive with energy, impossible to mistake for anything but dangerous. Zora's eyes went wide, his whole body shuddering with delight as he howled with laughter. He shouted something gleeful and incoherent, more joy than language, and looked around to share the moment. Colborough was 20 feet away, hunched behind the pillar with only his eyes and nose visible. He gave a single thumbs up. "Most pleased," he called. His arm didn't melt. Zora was testing the new Thunderblade, each swing humming with magical charge as he circled with Zirath across the far side of the lab. The paladin helped his forms without drawing steel, gesturing to open angles, poor footing, moments of imbalance. By the end, with Zirath's help, Zora would attune to his new weapon. Celia and Thomas sat nearby, watching with amused detachment as the two sparred. Celia sipped from a small tin of Shelbert's dubious brandy, remarking they probably, and only probably, shouldn't take bets. Thomas simply muttered that as long as nothing exploded, he was happy. At the other end of the lab, Friz had occupied one of the central workbenches, her nose buried in the pair of ledgers retrieved from Shelbert's overnight effort. The lamp beside her flickered as she pored through line after line, scribbling side notes, flipping pages, occasionally groaning at the absurdity of certain accounting entries. After some time, she called the others over. Her tone suggested she'd made sense of something, and her ink-stained fingers flipped through the two large books with confidence. She explained that the ledgers were mirrors, one for income, the other for investment. What she'd uncovered wasn't just questionable, it was strategic. She had to admit she admired the bookkeeping. The codes were elegant, complex, and consistent across millions of accounts, and the pages tabbed by importance, and only when someone in the group cleared their throat did Friz return on track to the point. The bank had been issuing upfront loans with little or no terms, directed toward the guilds, merchant houses, baronial estates, and particularly the wealthy, entrenched, and old families across the province. Many of the names were familiar. Tannertown's guildmasters and barons in particular featured heavily. What struck her was the silence on Flint's accounts. No withdrawals, no debits. His money remained untouched, despite his clear stake. Celia had leaned forward and offered a simple conclusion. That sounded an awful lot like a clean, legal way to buy influence. The others, silent for a moment, had offered nothing in return but agreement. Friz continued. The books showed a pattern of cultural and institutional support. The bank had been funding research at Mistra's. They'd provided direct financing to the King's Own Donkey, the infamous theatrical production that had cost a fortune to mount. At the same time, they were paying insurance to keep the Purple Theatre afloat, despite its doors being closed since the mysterious disappearance of its starlet. Zirath had muttered something about how any institution trying to feed both ends of a fire would eventually find itself with nothing but ash. Friz had nodded at that, flipping to a tucked-away page near the back. There, in the annexes of the investment ledger, was a letter. The letter was from the master engineer of the Great Works Guild. It was written to the bank, assessing the viability of the Dark Road Bridge between Tannertown and Tinborough. The analysis was grim. The terrain, the water table, the ashy foundation, none of it would support long-term construction. The engineer called the project near impossible, and confirmed the Guild would not, officially, endorse it. Despite this, Flint and Tinborough had funded the project anyway. They suspected the letter had never even reached Flint or Tinborough's guilds. Zora, who had been quiet until then, had said what everyone was thinking. If the bridge was doomed, then Thalia had died for nothing. The lab went quiet. No one responded for a long moment. Even Frizz closed the book and stared ahead for a beat. When she finally spoke again, it was with quiet certainty. The bank, she said, was everywhere. She opened the final page and pointed to a small entry written in precise script. Gold from Central City's Merchant Council, labelled as reserves, now held at Harken. Her summary was simple. The bank was stockpiling gold from the capital, issuing generous loans to every position of influence, and investing in both sides of high-risk ventures, regardless of feasibility. She looked up from the book and delivered her conclusion. Whatever was happening, it didn't add up. And then, after a short pause following muffled snickering, Frizz admitted she'd just realised the pun. The morning moved fast as the adventurers gathered their gear, bundling cloaks, counting potions, checking pouches, and began to talk through the next move. They agreed to leave shortly after first light, hoping to make the most of the road and arrive in Tannertown ahead of the midday traffic. The tournament was still drawing in crowds when they'd left, and they didn't know the full ramifications of their 3 capers just 2 days ago. As they packed gear, Thomas leaned over to Zirath and casually suggested they ask Shelbert to take a look at Dorf's old hammer. There was no telling what it was made of, and it might be worth knowing. Zirath agreed. They also wondered aloud, half serious, half daydreaming, just what else the tinker might be capable of building. The idea of more beetle bombs and sword constructs had the group speculating, and a little wary. As they spoke, Shelbert Culbra was already bustling toward a corner nook of the lab, which until now had been assumed to be storage. With surprising confidence, he announced that he'd make them travel meals. Before anyone could decline, he disappeared behind a sliding door labelled Perishables Preparation. What followed was a cacophony of bangs, whirs, and whistles. Something clanged twice. Something else hissed, followed by a single high-pitched ringing bell. A metal voice in the background shouted, "Preparation complete," before being immediately drowned out by another blast of steam. Shelbert re-emerged soon after, covered in soot from chin to ankles. His cooking apron, once white, was now streaked black and smelled faintly of oil and rosemary. In one hand, he carried a small tray stacked neatly with bundles wrapped in wax paper. He presented the contents proudly. Compact meals of fresh, dense bread surrounding small, squared sausages that, according to him, would retain heat far longer than they had any right to. He handed out bundles to each of them, gleefully telling of the origins of the machines. At the height of tinker construction, most bender crews didn't have time for long breaks. So instead of eating cold, workers relied on their worksite foremen to prepare meals in mere moments. These marvels, called foreman grills, could cook anything using internal flame chambers and rune-heated blades. He admitted, somewhat sheepishly, that he'd never quite figured out how the original grills worked, but he'd cobbled together something close. As they packed the meals into their satchels, Frizz proposed something plainly. If they came across any unusual devices, metals, or components, Culbra could have first look, provided he continued building or improving tools for their use. It was practical, efficient, and potentially profitable for both sides. Shelbert thought it over for no more than a heartbeat before snapping his fingers and sealing the deal with a handshake so fast it rattled Thomas's rings. He called it a noble agreement and added that scattered tinker dwellings still existed across the plains, hidden, half-buried, or worse, but each one likely housed relics and risks in equal measure. Dangerous places? Yes. But what challenge was that for the Heckfire Club? With that, Zirath placed Dorf's warhammer on a nearby table and asked if he had ever seen this sort of steel. Culbra moved to the table, adjusted the height with a foot lever, pulled over several standing lamps, each glowing a different hue, and clicked his goggles into place. The others stood back as he examined the weapon in silence, humming softly, muttering to himself, adjusting knobs and flipping through filters. Then, in usual Culbra fashion, came a small wonder-filled gasp. The hammer, he declared, was forged from adamantine, a metal pulled from near the hearts of volcanoes, so rare and stubborn that only the most skilled dwarven smiths could shape it. Its surface shimmered faintly, even in the dimmer light, and Culbra pointed out the complex runes etched into its head. These were not recent. They were old. The enchantments contained within were beyond his reading, but he speculated that the northern freeholds or the master forges in Tinborough might know more. Even as he spoke, he was already jotting notes in a looping, intricate script, thread script, the same encoded shorthand used by generations of tinkers to record theories and designs. The party watched him write, and in his movements saw a reflection of Frizz's own habits. She might not have noticed it, but everyone else did. The last of the packs were cinched, food and gear secured, armor checked, spells prepared. They were heading back into the world above, out to the plains, back toward Tannertown. The open plains stretched wide beneath the night sky, lit only by the soft burn of starlight and the crisp crescent of a moon that watched in silence. The walk was quiet, but the quiet did not comfort. They remembered the danger here, of beasts that stalked in silence, of predators far worse than wolves. Thomas raised a hand, muttered a word, and with a flutter of magic, summoned his owl, familiar, into existence. Its feathers shimmered faintly under moonlight as it took flight, rising high into the air to scout ahead. The sky was still, the stars so bright and clear they felt etched into glass. On the edge of the horizon, a single sliver of deep blue signalled the coming of dawn, but the land remained locked in quiet tension. After hours of travel, the owl shifted its flight. Something had caught its attention, a hawk, soaring even higher, mirroring their path, not attacking, not circling, tracking. They stopped to consider. Thomas relayed what he could sense from his familiar. The hawk showed no aggression. If it had wanted to strike, it would have. It felt somehow like it was drawing them in, an invitation. Zirath instead suggested a lure to an ambush. The owl followed, and the party, though wary, adjusted their course. The deviation wasn't far, only a few hours' delay from reaching Tannertown. They followed slowly, weapons not yet drawn but hands ready. Eventually the owl descended near a small camp just off a ridge, tucked against a rock outcropping. One large tent stood near a high-burning fire. Suspended over the flames on a thick wooden spit was the unmistakable shape of a full razor beast, skinned, seasoned, and roasting slowly, the meat dripping with fat into the embers. From above, the owl glimpsed movement. A green-skinned figure sat beside the fire. The party approached with caution. Blades loosened in scabbards, a spell on Frizz's fingertips, and Zirath's axe just near to his hand. As the firelight revealed more detail, they saw a tall, broad-shouldered figure, half-orc by the look of him, draped in rugged leathers marked with old tribal stitching. By his appearance was an orc mystic, a wanderer of the plains, dressed not for battle, but for travel and ritual. He wore a mantle of aged animal hides over a patchwork cloak, and trinkets made of bone, feather, and iron ringed the hem like charms. Beside the fire, resting with calm breath, stood a massive auroch, its horns thick and curved with age, its body saddled with light gear and decorated with sigils painted in ochre and ash. The beast stood placid, unmoving, utterly at ease in the half-orc's presence. The stranger didn't rise. He simply looked up, eyes glowing faintly in the light of the fire, waiting. Not in challenge, but in expectation. He offered no threat, no challenge. Instead, he welcomed them to his fire, his voice deep and even, lined with the worn edge of a lifetime spent speaking many tongues. The tension around the group eased, just slightly. Zora let his hand drop from his hilt. Frizz let her spell fizzle out at her fingertips. From overhead, the hawk swooped down in a clean arc and landed on the orc's forearm. Without looking, the half-orc tore a strip of raw meat from a clay dish beside him and tossed it skyward. The hawk caught it mid-flight and settled, content. Thomas's owl, watching closely from a low perch, fluttered down as well, wings spread in anticipation. The orc arched an eyebrow but offered another strip of meat. The owl snatched it with a screech and landed nearby, feathers ruffling with satisfaction. Even Thomas was surprised at how quickly it adapted to this new exchange. The half-orc turned back to the group, his tone clear and calm. The stars, said the half-orc, had told him to wait here, in this very spot. For what, he did not know, until this very moment. He said it was fated, that they would follow Tuha, his hawk, that their crossing had been seen, and the signs were clear. The fire cracked loudly, as if to underline his words, sending up a spatter of sparks into the growing dawn. He rose then, movements fluid and unhurried, standing to his full height, nearly level with Zirith. The auroch snorted softly and shifted, but did not stir. Then the orc spoke again, but this time in Draconic. Zirith stiffened. His chin lifted, his back straightened, and without missing a beat, he responded in kind. The tone of the conversation shifted. Their words were low and deliberate, and though the sounds were guttural and foreign to most of the party, there was no mistaking the reverence in the exchange. The rest of the group traded glances. Friz made a subtle shrug, clearly out of her depth with the language, and Thomas arched an eyebrow, quietly mouthing a guess or two without success. Then, without ceremony, the orc dropped to one knee before Zirath. His voice rang out clearly now, a single word spoken with solemn weight. Thranduil, the name, or title, hung in the air like a pronouncement. Thomas, eyes wide and expression halfway between impressed and concerned, leaned slightly forward and cleared his throat. He asked, hesitant but not mocking, what exactly that word meant. Zirath didn't answer right away. The fire flickered between them, low and steady, casting long shadows across the half-orc's tent and the sleeping form of the auroch. The hawk let out a low chirp and flapped once, then settled again. The others waited, watching Zirath closely. His eyes were fixed on the fire, unmoving. When he finally spoke, he did so evenly, carefully. He said that the common tongue lacked a proper word for what had just been spoken. The shape of the meaning, he added, didn't sit cleanly in translation. Thomas leaned forward, squinting. With all the seriousness he could muster, he insisted Zirath try anyway. Everyone else waited in silence, the question now burning too brightly to leave unanswered. Zirath inhaled once through his nose. Then, with a tone that betrayed neither pride nor denial, he said that Thranduil meant king. After a beat of confused disbelief, chaos erupted among the group. Thomas flailed his arms in mock betrayal. Friz gasped and pointed at Zirath, like he'd just confessed to being a dragon in disguise. Celia actually dropped her satchel in disbelief. Zora sputtered, demanding to know how long this had been true, and whether or not they'd violated any etiquette by letting him carry firewood on night watch. Someone asked if bowing was required. Another asked if they should have been calling him your scaleness all along. Zirath didn't flinch, didn't smile, his voice cut cleanly through the babble. He said his father was king. That quieted them, somewhat. The weight of it sank in. Zirath's father, the one he had rarely spoken of, the possibility of his death, of a homeland now absent a ruler. The implications turned the moment somber for a breath, and then Thomas shook his head and declared it didn't matter. They had been travelling with royalty, and not one of them had known. The orc, watching patiently, lifted a hand and silenced the chatter with a quiet grunt. He once again returned to speaking common. The Bloodfire clan, he said, nodding to Zirath, and the half-orc tribes of the orcish reaches had shared allegiances for generations. Their loyalties were bound by oath and deed. The half-orc leaned forward, quieter now, but carrying a tale long held in the chest. He said he had spent 12 summers and winters out here on the open plains. Alone. Exiled. Before that he had been a chieftain, answering only to one, the chief of chiefs, the orc mother herself. His title had once carried meaning, authority, purpose. The reaches had been his home, and the fire of his blood had burned proudly beneath the banners of his ancestors. But then an emissary came, a human powerful in their own right, with silver at their temples and the bearing of old nobility. The envoy had crossed the western border, past the ancient elven tribes, beyond the Red Stone Valley, and stood before the clans as a diplomat of something older, something rooted in the ancient houses of humans. For 3 days, the emissary and the chiefs talked, and at the end of it, a new allegiance was forged. Razorclaw, his name now spoken without pride or shame, said the allegiance of Bloodfire had been questioned, challenged. A new Thranduil had been named by proxy, and the old blood, absent and voiceless, was cast aside. He reached into a pouch at his belt and threw a handful of fine powder into the fire. The flames hissed and flared green, purple and red, and the smoke took on form, curving upward in shapes and silhouettes. First came the hulking outlines of orcs around a great fire, then a tall figure hooded with a shining crest on their shoulder. Sparks flared like embers falling into place, painting the dark blue sky with stories made of light and smoke. The fire showed the challenge. Razorclaw, among some other orcish houses, had stood against the decision. If the Bloodfire King could not stand and speak, he had offered to do so in his place. He challenged the Orc Mother herself, an act not of hubris, he said, but born of oaths. The hulking figure dancing in the flames and smoke, terrible in her aspect, savaged another orc, Razorclaw. He'd lost, his challenge at the hands of the Orc Mother, Chief of Chiefs, his body and face still bearing the scars. Dismissed, said Razorclaw, his punishment had been exile. It was to him a display of forced obedience, serving as a warning to the other clans. There was honour in death. There was no honour in exile. The Orc Mother had not let him die. But before he left the Reaches, having been forced to heal and mend his broken bones for the journey south, he'd been told the Bloodfire flag had been raised, flown from the western coast, as call for aid. Zora and Celia exchanged glances, but neither spoke. Their eyes were on Zirath, whose gaze never once left the fire. His face was unreadable, his body still. That aid, said the half-orc, studying the dancing sparks and smoke, would never come. Green shapes in the coloured smoke, standing behind red flags, vanished. Whatever vows Zirath's father might have believed still bound the clans, they would be answered with silence. Zirath's head bowed just slightly. He said nothing. The last image in the flame twisted and stretched, a fluttering shape of sparks and grey wisps that briefly took the form of the Bloodfire banner. Then the wind took it, and it was gone. But some orcs, he said, remembered their oaths. The stars had shifted, and the winds whispered change. He turned to Zirath then, his tone sharpening. He asked plainly if Zirath knew the ways of the orcs. Zirath met his gaze without hesitation. He said that he did. At that, the half-orc stepped away from the fire, the dawn now breaking across the plain in hues of gold and grey. He stripped off his cloak and rolled his shoulders, muscles tight beneath his leathers. He moved into a low stance, balanced and grounded, both hands raised slightly, open but ready. He called out the proposal in a voice that carried cleanly across the field, as the mystic, once calm as swaying grass, knelt and beat a fist into the ground, before standing again. They would settle it the orcish way, catch as catch can. This time it was Zora who raised a hand slowly and asked, with increasing concern, what exactly that phrase meant, as the orc's knuckles cracked and his feet began to circle. Zirath stepped forward, raising one hand to his companions without looking back. They, he said firmly, were not to interfere. The half-orc wasted no time. With a sudden burst of motion, he lunged from his stance, closing the space between them in a heartbeat. The two collided with a sound like stone cracking against stone. Shoulders met, arms locked, legs braced, muscles tensed in unison, twitching with the strain of leverage and raw power. The orc drove forward with practiced brutality, every bit the hardened nomad his presence had suggested. For a moment, Zirath's footing gave. The ground shifted beneath him, his boots skidding a half-step across the dirt. A rare grunt escaped the dragonborn's lips. Then, something in him surged. From deep inside, Zirath pulled on a reserve far older than his training, older than his oaths. His father's lessons, the lonely road of exile, the promise of vengeance, and the weight of his bloodline coalesced into motion. He twisted his hips, slid a leg behind the orc's knee, and with a sharp, brutal turn of his torso, brought the full force of his body to bear. The half-orc hit the earth with a thunderous impact, enough to make the auroch flinch where it rested 10 feet away. But the fight wasn't over. The orc growled, chest rising with the effort, and writhed beneath the dragonborn's hold. Zirath clamped down, shifting his weight to maintain the pin. He struck the ground once with his foot. The orc snarled and twisted, almost breaking free with a last surge of strength. But Zirath adjusted, grit his teeth, and poured everything he had into keeping his opponent grounded. A second tap came, his muscles straining visibly. The third tap followed, clean and final. The orc's body went still beneath him. A moment passed, then another, before the half-orc reached across his chest and slammed a hand against his heart, uttering a phrase in orcish, guttural, reverent. The sound carried across the plains, and the party felt the half-orc's call in their very bones. Both fighters lay still, breath heaving from their chests. Slowly, Zirath rose. The first golden rays of dawn caught the edges of his scales, casting them in glints of copper and firelight. The fire crackled low beside him, reduced now to quiet embers. The half-orc stood, head bowed. He looked up at Zirath with clarity in his gaze, and declared that the Thranduil had risen. The ancient allegiance lived on. He gestured toward the spit where the razor beast still turned over glowing coals. He invited them all to break fast with him and to listen. The party approached wordlessly, and they sat. Razorclaw leaned forward again, feeding another log into the fire, and dusted his hands clean with deliberate care. He spoke of a stranger who had come weeks ago, a man cloaked and hooded, wearing deep purple, stormy grey, and trim of gold polished like coin. A city dweller by his bearing. The party stirred. These were the colours of Harken Bank. The stranger had spoken politely, plainly. Few people ever crossed the plains alone, and Razorclaw was no fool. When a man braved this wild silence, it was for purpose. So he listened. After all, conversation with a hawk and an auroch, however loyal, could stretch thin after a dozen seasons. The hawk screeched, almost sounding offended. Friz narrowed her eyes. She asked, with a tone too casual to be innocent, what exactly the representative had come seeking. Razorclaw's answer came without hesitation. They had wanted the Quicksteel Tourney to showcase the finest talent across the province, fighters who could draw crowds, stir wagers. He had been offered 3,000 gold pieces up front. Razorclaw admitted he was no fool. There was truth to the stranger words, but they masked the motive. To the mystic's eyes, he had the bearing of a deceiver. Zora gave a low whistle. Celia's expression darkened. Razorclaw's voice turned blunt then. Were it not for the gold, the tourney was of no concern to him. City-dweller festivals meant little to him. Then, he said what everyone had already begun to suspect. To win, he would have to kill Thaddeus Flint. Frizz's mind spun through the ledgers they'd seen, the coded transactions, the unusual deposits of exactly 3,000 gold sent to obscured accounts. One entry could be written off. But several? She filed the suspicion away, eyes unfocused as the possibility took shape. Celia's gaze drifted to the orc's twin weapons, the curved boar tusks. Now, closer to the firelight, the craftsmanship became clearer. Carved not just for war, but with purpose. Notched edges, reinforced grips, brutal and elegant. They were the weapons of a hunter and warrior, made from the bones of the plains themselves. Thomas, half lounging by the log pile, asked what Razorclaw made of Thaddeus Flint. The half-orc's reply was measured, but consistent with what others had said, if a little more respectful. Flint was a man marked, bound to the phantom by oath or pact, trained in silence beneath skies touched by something older than gods. Razorclaw did not mock him, and seemed to know much of the phantom. He spoke of him like one speaks of a wildfire, dangerous, destructive, but with a kind of natural inevitability. Among the city dwellers, as he called them, Flint had brought a strange calm. Before Flint, he said, the plains had smelled of blood. Ranches burned, herds slaughtered, and the wind never carried peace. Too many wolves fighting for the pack. After Flint came to power, that changed. The killings stopped. Razorclaw made no claim to know how, only that they had. It was Zirath who asked the question that no one else had: why the gold? The half-orc looked up from the fire, not with hesitation but gravity. His answer was simple. The gold would buy him passage, armour, supplies, bribes for safe passage. The road back would not be welcoming. But the stars had spoken. The signs had appeared again and again. His exile had run its course. The fire had burned low by the time they rose. The scent of roasted meat still lingered in their cloaks, and the faintest streaks of dawn painted the horizon in soft peach and amber. They offered their thanks to Razorclaw, for the fire, the food, and the stories, and made their way back to the road. No grand farewells were spoken, just a nod, and the quiet understanding that paths, once crossed, had a way of finding each other again. Razorclaw had left an impression, not just for his skill or his bearing, but for the calm weight of someone who carried exile without shame. As the group turned their feet toward Tannertown, the plains opened before them. Winds moved gently across the tall grass, and the silence was not unfriendly. Zirath led, a few paces ahead. He didn't acknowledge the looks traded behind him. Whatever they were thinking, it didn't matter. In his mind, the word Thranduil still belonged to someone else, his father, and his oath to vengeance, to legacy, remained untouched by any claim to title. But the path kept shifting. The Vestran orb, the whispers of ancient families who once ruled his homeland, now turning wheels in merchant councils. The exile in the dust who spoke of broken alliances and the fading of old powers. His grip had tightened on the haft of his axe without him noticing. Not until Zora, walking at his side, made a flat, off-hand remark that there would be no way he was calling him Your Majesty. Zirath said nothing. At first, Zora glanced over, ready to let the joke land and move on, when Zirath quietly replied that he probably should. Zora laughed, and the others joined in with a mix of groans and grins. For a moment, the weight eased, and the strange tension of the morning gave way to something simpler. They were almost to Tannertown. The Quicksteel Tourney loomed, but the road still stretched out ahead, and for now the Heckfire Club walked it as one. The day's march toward Tannertown passed with a strange, subdued quiet. The road, however, was anything but empty. Lines of travellers, caravans and couriers stretched along the ridges and wagon paths, all drawn by the same pull, the Quicksteel Tourney. More people than the roads were built to handle, and yet still they came. From as far as the dune breaks and the forest rim, they came to see. The tent camps had grown massive in their absence. Colourful cloth and patched canvas stretched in every direction around the outskirts of the city, ringing the walls in a makeshift sprawl of flags, cook-fires and games of chance. Meats turned slowly on spits, traders barked their wares, and everywhere the air buzzed with the murmur of festival excitement. But beneath it all, a quieter current had taken hold. The Black Stones had arrived. That was the whisper repeated again and again, passed in casual tones between guardsmen and potboys, muttered by performers and merchants in the shadows of their stalls. Not just the tourney now. Something had changed. The party pushed through the city gates, keeping to the thickest crowds, hoods drawn, heads low. Tannertown swelled with life, and the city's energy masked their movement well enough. They wound through market lanes and past drunken chants from hastily built pubs until one of the larger plazas opened up before them. And there it was. Obsidian black and monolithic, the stone stood as tall as a hill giant, ringed with soft blue light and pulsing runes. The surface shimmered faintly with contained power. Around its base, a respectful distance had been given by the crowds, not from fear, but from uncertainty. The people simply didn't know what it was yet. Friz leaned forward, already mouthing the runes aloud. She caught the shape of thaumaturgy, then message. And others. Sigils bound to amplification, projection, stability. It wasn't just magic. It was a feat of coordinated arcana, refined, layered, and strong. It had not been built by one mage, but by many. And recently. A murmur swept through the onlookers. The runes began to glow. A hush fell, and then a voice rang out, not loud, but clear. Every street, every alley, every crowded square suddenly heard the same solemn cadence. It was Grand Lord Magister Cedric Aldercrest, and he had a message for the people of Verdun. The voice poured from the obsidian stone with eerie clarity. No echo, no distortion. It cut through the din of the plaza and beyond, threading its way down every street, every alley, every tavern. He addressed the people of Verdun, stating that he spoke not as a nobleman, but as a servant of the province and its peoples. A skeptical voice near the edge of the crowd muttered that nobles always said such things, right before raising taxes. Closer to the stone, a group of well-dressed merchants stood silent, nodding faintly in agreement. He announced that the massive sending stones had now been erected in each of the major cities, marking the beginning of a new era of communication. He credited the scholars of Mistra for this achievement, thanking them for their tireless magical research and perseverance, particularly during such uncertain times. A few younger citizens clapped lightly at the mention of Mistra, clearly impressed by the magical accomplishment. Others shifted uncomfortably, whispering about what kind of messages might start coming through now, and from whom. Friz went pale. This was not the institution she remembered. Maestra's Arcane Institute had always been about the devotion to arcana, and not beholden to politics. She nearly missed the rest of Lord Aldercrest's speech. Continuing, the solemn Lord Magister acknowledged that the recent closure of the Scribes' Guild had been divisive. But in his capacity as chair of the Merchants' Council, he reminded the public that leadership often required difficult decisions. He reaffirmed his support for the Council's resolution, not, he said, for the sake of control, but to preserve clarity and unity. The Council, he claimed, did not act as rulers, but as stewards of the realm's fragile cohesion. The reaction turned tense. One older woman in fine cedar crest furs hissed under her breath, calling it a power grab in everything but name. A stout man in sailing finery nearby voiced that if the scribes hadn't been so corrupt, maybe they wouldn't have been replaced. Arguments broke out in pockets. The party sensed the rising tension in the crowds. He spoke of his decade of service on the council and admitted that discourse over the province's direction remained ongoing, spirited and passionate. He urged the people not to drift further apart. A vote of confidence in his leadership was approaching, and he welcomed it. He pledged to continue serving at the pleasure of the people, until such time as the council chose a successor. A few voices responded with short bursts of applause. Others crossed their arms and said nothing. More arguments broke out among the listening denizens, some calling his awaited departure good riddance, whereas others denounced the Merchants' Council's headhunt. Others in the crowd shouted for quiet to listen. He turned to the matter of the Quicksteel Tourney, acknowledging that many had travelled eastward to Tannertown. Though he could not be there in person, he extended his wishes to the champions to fight with honour, and to the spectators to let camaraderie triumph over conflict. He hoped the tournament would serve as a reminder that the people of Verdun could still gather not only in arms, but in spirit. A cheer rose at the mention of the tourney, short-lived but genuine. The tournament brought excitement after all. For a moment, even cynics allowed themselves a flicker of enthusiasm. Shouts of city names and champions rose from the crowd. Lord Aldercrest, in closing, reminded all who listened to remember what united Verdun in these uncertain days. That statement drew more silence than anything else. A few nodded solemnly. Others turned and walked away before the light of the stone faded, as if unsure whether they felt more hopeful or uneasy. Then, without flourish, he ended the message. That, he said, would be all. The runes went dark, and the spire of black obsidian stood among the plaza, jutting out against the sandy cobblestone tones of Tannertown. The plaza stood quiet for several heartbeats before the noise of the city resumed, less like conversation, more like pressure being released. Friz gathered the party. She remembered the first Quill's words when the Scribes' Guild had been shuttered. The proud woman had said to Friz to watch for the shadow of the stone 1 hour after midday. The party agreed, and in the busy and bustling plaza, they waited. The sun hung high and hot over Tannertown, pressing down on the crowds packed tight into the plaza. It was a crush of sweat, chatter, and anticipation. Citizens and travellers from across the province jammed shoulder to shoulder. Banners fluttered overhead. Children darted through the crowd with skewers of grilled meat. Merchants shouted prices at anyone who would listen. All of it buzzed around a single thought: the Quicksteel Tourney. The party remained alert, scanning the sea of faces for familiar ones. None appeared. Zirath guessed the city had swelled past 80,000, maybe more. It was a number that made sense, but still sounded absurd. There was no privacy, no escape, just humanity in motion pressed wall to wall. Time passed with a kind of slow agony, made worse by the constant sense of exposure. Even amid the crowd, they felt like targets. The sun inched across the sky, casting the Sending Stone's shadow further into the plaza. They watched it. They waited. Midday came and went. The shadow pointed now toward a cluster of carts, 6 in all, crowded with goods and ringed by talkative vendors. That was when Friz saw her. An old woman in ragged grey seated quietly on the ground between 2 of the carts. She had a small basket in front of her. Her eyes were hidden behind stained cloth, and her skin looked thin as paper. Her sign, written in uneven hand, read simply, "For the hungry." There had been no beggars in Tannertown last time they passed through. That had struck them all at the time. This, while outwardly unremarkable, stood out. Friz moved first, and Thomas made a suggestion under his breath. They should flank her, draw less attention. Zora and Celia followed suit, moving slowly, naturally, creating the illusion of a few strangers near the same spot. Friz approached the woman. She dropped a coin in the basket. The old woman gave a soft, frail thank you. Friz turned to walk away, and the voice behind her asked a question. The words weren't shouted, they weren't loud, but Friz heard them all the same. The voice asked what dies in the dark. Friz stopped mid-step. The riddle turned in her mind. The answer came quickly. She'd heard those words before, just 4 days ago, at the closing of the Scribes' Guild. The first Quill had spoken them. She turned, heart racing. The answer came out steady, the truth. And in that moment, she saw it. The disguise was perfect, beyond perfect. No magic, just pure, unmatched skill. Her voice was altered, her posture collapsed and aged. Even the feel of her body was different. Friz would never have known. But it was her. The old woman asked if the young one might help her to the well. Her throat was dry, the crowds too thick. She was just too old. Friz nodded, helped her up. The woman leaned heavily against her. She felt frail. That illusion, too, was part of the act. Friz played her role and began leading her away. The rest of the party watched in quiet confusion. Friz gave a subtle nod. That was all they needed. They followed behind, loosely, still unsure, but trusting enough not to interrupt. At the well, Friz helped pump water into a small cup the woman produced from her cloak. The old hands shook as she brought it to her lips. Friz opened her mouth to speak, but the woman raised a single finger, silencing her while she drank. Around them, the plaza churned and no one paid them any mind. Friz didn't notice at first the man with a cart who paused on one corner, the couple with a map near another, the butcher with a bloody apron lighting a pipe at the third. They weren't close, but they were positioned. Then the cup lowered. The woman's hand dropped to her side, and with it came a pulse. Something Friz felt more than saw. A change in the air. The woman spoke, and this time it was the voice Friz remembered. She said the variant scrying spell would hold for 5 minutes. No one could overhear. Frizz turned her head quickly, meeting the eyes of the others across the plaza. Frizz didn't waste a second. With the protection of the scrying spell in place, her first question came quiet and sharp. What had the first quill made of Aldercrest's broadcast? The old woman didn't soften the answer. Aldercrest's time was coming to an end. The Merchants' Council was expected to vote within 2 weeks on his removal. The outcome, however, would be close. A handful of magisters and mid-tier merchant lords could swing it either way. A diplomatic meeting was set to happen soon, she said, at the Golden Dragon, a renowned restaurant in Central City, where such things were often debated over heavy wine and private rooms. The real influence, she implied, would be traded behind velvet curtains, not over the sending stones. One councillor from Westport, Anya Valarian in particular, had been rallying votes to keep Aldercrest in power. Frizz, in return, offered something of value. She spoke carefully, drawing from the now unlocked Harken ledgers. There were patterns, loans issued without proper terms, some seemingly without expectation of repayment. Funds flowed into guilds, merchant houses, even noble families, many with old Verdun ties, and there were investments that made little sense. Acquisitions of failing businesses, donation-sized purchases of obscure art, even backing unproven magical research. It all smelled like manoeuvring. She left out the Tanner Town heist. That wasn't for sharing. Not yet. The first quill listened closely, then nodded, slowly. Someone, she said, was buying influence, and if Harken Bank wasn't behind it directly, then someone had co-opted its systems to get it done. Either way, the threads led back to the same loom, and they didn't have long before those patterns were sewn into permanence. The quill mentioned the recent incident at the Tannertown Harken Bank, saying that apparently the manager had been sacked by Harken. Her sources said it was something about a missing set of vault keys, but suspected that was more pretense than anything. Rumours among travellers and local folk swelled. Robberies, heists, break-ins at the Velvet Fang. Though there was some fire there, her sources seemed to think it was mostly smoke. In fact, the local manager had been asking questions about gold reserves, and perhaps one too many. Frizz nodded and made note of that. She and her fellow adventurers hadn't quite figured out the fallout from their 3 capers, and this seemed to be one piece. Frizz then asked the first quill what she, and her fellow disbanded scribes, meant to do next. The first quill of Tannertown's answer came without hesitation. She said she would do what any good journalist must when power that stifles truth. She would rebel, and with that she closed her eyes for the briefest moment, as if locking something away, and resumed her role, back into the tremble, the hunched posture, the frailty of the blind beggar by the well. As the final seconds of the spell waned, the plaza's noise reclaimed the space. The tourists folded up their map and drifted into the crowd. The butcher flicked ash from his pipe and returned to his stall. The man with the cart wheeled it forward and out of sight. One by one they vanished into the market. The old woman lowered herself slowly back to the stones near the well and resumed her stillness. Her hand trembled just enough to rattle the coin basket. Frizz lingered for a breath, then turned and walked back toward the others. She didn't speak right away, but she had learned something, and she liked the old woman. Frizz regrouped with the others near the edge of the plaza. Without a word, she guided them into a narrow alley tucked behind a line of merchant carts, far from the main bustle. The heat still clung to the walls, but it was quiet, enough for words to carry without being overheard. She told them everything. The beggar had been no beggar at all, but the first quill, the same woman they'd met during the closing hours of the Scribes' Guild. The disguise had been flawless, not just in look, but in voice, posture, even the feeling of her presence. It had taken Frizz everything she had to realize it. Celia shook her head with something between disbelief and admiration. She said it plainly. The old woman had fooled them all. Zora pointed out something else. The Golden Dragon, the restaurant where this quiet, powerful meeting was being arranged, was the same one involved in the tourney, funded by Harken, and with ties back to Professor Vorenthaler. This to him was no accident. Zirath stepped in next. The name Frizz had mentioned, the Nettleport councillor brokering the meeting, was no stranger to him. Anya. He had crossed paths with her before, months ago, when the hunter from the Darkwood had sent him west. In his view, she had stood for unity, and spoke firmly against the encroaching power of the old noble lines. If she was trying to preserve Aldercrest's place, there was more to the story. Frizz nodded and added one last piece, the bank manager they had once tracked, quietly removed, officially over lost vault keys. But 3 days ago, when Frizz had peeked into her thoughts with magic, she had sensed something deeper. The manager had been asking questions about gold reserves, questions someone didn't want answered. Central City was pulling them back in, the bank, the families, Vorenthaler. It was all connected. The picture was forming, just slowly enough to keep slipping out of focus. If they formed the web, who or what was the spider they'd prophetically been told about? Their thoughts circled back to the tourney. One thread refused to let go. Harken Bank had been paying champions to fight. Quietly, strategically. The tourney was no longer just a show, it clearly was another set piece in the bigger play. Celia said it aloud. If the bank wanted Thaddeus Flint dead, this was the perfect way. Pay killers to compete, incentivize them to reach the final round, then sit back and watch. The thought got silence from the party. Thaddeus Flint's role in the scheme of things was an outlier, and one they couldn't quite put in place of the larger puzzle. The next step was obvious, the tourney was beginning. As they debated their next move, someone suggested something bold, crazy, and borderline reckless. They could go to the Velvet Fang. Just walk in, act like they belonged there. Their old rooms might even still be booked. The idea was outrageous, dangerous, and exactly the kind of plan the Heckfire Club would follow through on. They left the alley behind, moving past the crowds, and made for the hotel. On the way to the hotel, there was a sudden and unexpected detour. With the plaza still thrumming with noise behind them, and the strange encounter with the disguised first quill lingering in the air, Celia made a decision that caught the group by surprise. She said she would enter the tourney, no speech, no drama, just calm certainty. Her training, she said, leaned into evasion, not domination. That kind of precision might go far in a contest like this. Besides, she'd earned a good amount from the gauntlet. And steel was an honest investment. They passed through the noise and colour of the tourney lanes and ducked into the quieter edge of the city, where the sounds of cheering gave way to the steady hum of tanneries, the distant clatter of looms, and the sharper smells of dye, hide, and steel. There, tucked between a wool mill and a boarded storefront, stood the weathered sign they remembered. Dagger Dax's Hardware. The exterior was plain, rough-hewn, practical. Inside it was anything but. Daggers of all makes, sizes, and craftsmanship rested behind glass and along dark-stained wooden walls. Etched hilts, curved steel, bone-handled stilettos, and ceremonial blades sat in elegant displays. No clutter, no nonsense. A curated collection, as refined as it was deadly. The shop attendant, a familiar old man with watchful eyes and a steady gait, glanced up as they entered. Recognition flickered across his face. He gave a quiet, honest welcome back. He remembered them from their patronage the week prior. As Celia, Zora, and Zirath moved among the displays, examining steel and weight, Thomas and Frizz lingered by the counter. Casual questions followed. They asked about champions, whether any names had come through. The old man leaned against the case, considered, and said one had drawn some talk. A jade-masked monk seen prowling the streets after sundown. One by the name of Ronin, a hired blade. Rumour was they'd been trained out of the Temple of Shadows. The name alone turned heads. The attendant clarified that the cutthroat didn't buy blades, though. Preferred to craft instead their own from polished bamboo, sharpened to a deadly edge. With enough precision, said the old man, it could kill as clean as steel and be tossed in the fire. The conversation shifted quietly to Thaddeus Flint. Their questions were careful, but something in the old man's expression shifted. His voice tightened. They pushed, just slightly, and the wall cracked. But he came in nearly every day as he would open the store for business. The party tensed, realizing just how narrowly they had missed him. Frizz asked if that meant Flint trusted the shop or its blades, maybe. But the old man said no. Mr. Flint, as he always called him, trusted no one with his blades. He sharpened them himself. Still, he came here. And each time he tried to cover the shop's rent, expenses, sometimes more. Thomas leaned in. He asked softly how the old man managed to refuse him. The answer came quiet but firm. Miss Flint wouldn't have it. He'd stood his ground ever since she left for the Darkwood, maybe foolishly, but he refused every coin, every offer, and every favour. Because Dax, as the old man said, deserved to walk on her own 2 feet. She'd made that clear. And Flint, whatever else he was, owed the old man something. That was how he'd survived it. That was the only reason he could say no. Celia saw the goodness in him. She'd bet her life he'd helped raise the girl somehow, a surrogate father. He reminded her of her own father, the way he'd worry for Celia. Dax and Thaddeus were cut from the same cloth, he said, just from opposite ends of the sheet. There was a pause, a moment where no one seemed quite sure what to say. Then Celia stepped forward. She placed 2 daggers on the counter. Simple, curved, balanced. No ornamentation, just good steel. She said she'd take them. The old man straightened slightly, his face slipping back into the charm of a merchant from the eastern frontier. 500 gold for the pair, and with a lively "sold" from Celia. The tourney would see a new champion throw her dagger in the ring. Celia of Saffron Sands, warrior of mercy. By the time they left Dagger Dax's hardware and made their way to the hotel, the velvet fang was nearly unrecognizable. Normally, a space of calm elegance had become a bustling hub of colour and chaos. Lines stretched out in every direction. Nobles, spectators and hopefuls jockeying for position beneath city flags flown high. Every major province had sent their colours, their cheers and their champions. The opening ceremony loomed, and no one wanted to miss it. Guards in fine livery flanked the main gates, separating ticket holders and hotel patrons from the masses, trying to catch a glimpse. The party approached slowly, navigating the waves of people and attention. They still held their brass keys. Nothing special, not the crystal passes of the upper suites, but keys nonetheless. An attendant spotted them and waved them to the front. She asked, as formally as she could manage, if they had a room. They nodded. Her relief was visible. She launched into what was clearly a well-rehearsed reassurance. The rumours about failed security were false. The hotel was protected, especially the Velvet Suites, with the finest in automated stewards from Tinborough. As a show of confidence, the Silver Valets, as she called them, had been enhanced. These constructs could now identify not only the access crystals but the rightful bearers of them as well. The Velvet Suites, she repeated, were the safest place in the city. Thomas, deadpan, said he believed her. The young woman seemed heartened by that, offering a grateful nod before resuming her frantic work managing crowds and expectations. Inside, signs directed guests toward the festivities, a hootenanny at sunset, complete with a performance by Amadeus von Halen and blood oath ceremonies for the tourney champions. The party had time before the celebration began. They slipped back into their rooms, miraculously still reserved, and took the time to rest. It was not lost on them, and they were the cause of the heightened security. The short rest they managed was welcome. When the sun dipped low, they reassembled in the great hall. Thomas, however, was already scanning the room, looking for familiar or perhaps dangerous faces. And sure enough, he so happened to spot one such face. There, crossing the marble floor with a slow and deliberate stride, was Thaddeus Flint. He was flanked by 6 figures, barons and guild leaders by the look of them, all Tannertown's finest, wrapped in elegant leather and understated authority. They moved like a tide, parting the crowd by presence alone. Without warning, Thomas stepped away from the group, cutting across the floor. The others didn't have time to stop him. In seconds, he was standing directly in Flint's path. Frizz, Zora, and Zerath, mortified, thought this had the makings of the sand golem all over again. He addressed him with unsettling clarity, asking how it felt to compete in a tourney where every person at his side stood to gain from his death. He asked if Flint considered himself a good bet. The hall went quiet in a ripple. 30 feet away, the rest of the party froze. Flint's retinue stood stone still. A few glanced to Flint. A few glared at Thomas. The silence stretched, the tension coiled. Flint looked at him, just looked. Then, with a flat, unmoved tone, he told Thomas to crawl back into whatever bottle he'd just stumbled out of, and turned, continuing on. There was no outburst, no threat. But Thomas saw it in his eyes. Flint wasn't caught off guard. He wasn't confused. He knew exactly the position he was in. The danger wasn't new. He'd already made peace with it. Thomas returned to the group. Zora asked him, low, sharp, what in the hells he thought he was doing. Thomas simply said the place was already soaked in oil and pitch. He figured it was time to toss a spark. He asked earnestly for the party to trust him on his hunch. Despite everything, they did. But there was no denying it, he'd stuck his neck out. And by doing so, he'd stuck theirs out with him. Inside the grand ballroom of the Velvet Fang, the crush of bodies made movement near impossible. Over 2,000 had packed into the expansive chamber and its adjoining smoke halls and velvet-curtained boudoir. Chandeliers glistened with magical light, and trays of glistening flutes and strange tropical concoctions floated just above the crowd, carried by unseen or enchanted hands. Music thundered from the stage, Von Halen's signature stomp beats shaking the floorboards, creating a chaos that threatened to swallow every word, every whispered suspicion. The party scanned the crowd, but it was hopeless. Even the sharpest eyes couldn't pick out familiar faces in this sea of nobility, mercenaries, gamblers and gawkers. And yet, for all the tension and unknowns lingering from the weeks before, the air shimmered with festivity. The merriment was real, electric. Rivalries were visible, some playful, some not, but the crowd loved it. For now, it was celebration. Attendants finally relented to Zora's call and Thomas's wit, parting long enough for drinks to find their way into adventurer hands. But the music was cut short as an amplified voice rolled across the room. The ceremony was about to begin. Gasps and murmurs moved through the crowd as Central City's banking delegation stepped on stage, led by none other than the chief comptroller himself. The adventurers exchanged briefly, wondering where Lady of Inkwell, who shared no love of the bank, might be in the large crowd. Moments later, Thaddeus Flint emerged from the stage to applause from the crowd as well, stone-faced, flanked by his entourage of baronesses and guildsmen. The announcer, likely unaware of the animosity between them, welcomed both parties with equal enthusiasm. The rules of the Quicksteel Tourney were restated by the magistrates, courtesy of Harken Bank. The announcer was all charm and smiles, stating that, as always, a blood-binding oath would seal each champion to the terms. To oversee it, said the announcer, they'd given the honour of Master of Right to none other than Brother Malkesh, cleric of the Unbound. The room dimmed instantly, plunged in total darkness. Magic swept through the air. The crowd gasped, instincts flared. Zora's hand drifted toward his blade. Zerath's brow lowered. For a split second, they were ready for a fight. Then torchlight sprang to life, one flame at a time, guiding the eye toward the stage. The ballroom shimmered with crafted illusion. Lights danced. A phantom chorus whispered something ancient and distant. Awe overtook fear. The lights had lit a suddenly present Brother Malkesh, adorned by his dozens of idols and tokens who bowed deeply to the crowd. This, the party remembered now, was still a show, and Malkesh's work in the Broken Chain arena had revealed a certain flair for the dramatic, perhaps enjoyed by the strange cleric. Malkesh took the stage, arms folded behind his back, walking the pace of a blind man, The party knew better and was proved right when, with a theatrical flourish, he produced a silk cloth from thin air. It seemed to grow overlarge and colourful to collective oohs and ahs. Then he snapped it backward, revealing a table that hadn't been there a breath before. Cheers followed loud applause. Some in the party wondered how much he'd charged for that little spectacle. On the table, strange colour-flamed candles, just as the party had seen at the altar of the Unbound. In the centre, an ancient auroch skull with black horns and candles lit behind the hollow eyes. The symbol of the phantom, spirit of the plains. Locals knew of this mystical demigod and looked upon it with reverence. Malkesh's voice carried like distant thunder, dry, raspy, ceremonial. He reminded the crowd that the blood rites preserved balance. The pact was sacred. Breaking it would stir spirits older than memory. Those who swore would bear the mark of the phantom and would be honour-bound to follow the ancient ways of the blade. The brother asked for silence and promptly received it. Then the fallen cleric called for the first champion to step forward and seal the rite. Flint approached, said nothing, drew a dagger and dragged the edge across his palm. Blood welled and fell onto the obsidian bull skull resting on the table. The eyes ignited with flame. A mark burned into the air and seared on the flesh above his hand. He gave Malkesh a nod and stepped back. It was done. One by one, champions stepped forward, swearing oaths and taking their respective marks. The crowd roared for their own. Banners waved, drinks spilled, and names echoed. Each made their way to the skull. Each offered blood and bound themselves. Friz spotted Amadeus von Halen, scribbling something in a songbook. The man was deep in thought, writing something. His purple overcoat and silk scarves billowed as he wrote down notation and lyric. She wondered if that's how she looked to others when she wrote down her thoughts. The showman and announcer quickly took the champions' pedigrees and announced their names to goad the crowd, among them Thaddeus Flint of Tannertown, Ronin, hired assassin from the Shadow Valleys, Duck, the obsidian champion of the blasted canyons, Blondie monster slayer out of Nettleport, Celia, warrior of mercy from Saffron Sands, Zora, barbarian, son of the Verdant farmlands, Lady, loved by the courts, the jewel of Inkwell, Zirath, vengeance-bound paladin from distant shores, Razorclaw, the exiled mystic of the Orcish reaches, Lucky, Cedar Crest's fortunate gambler, Big Iron, hammer o' the hills, down from Tinborough. Then came Jade, a tall elf, sinewy and sharp-eyed, likely a ranger from the jungle tropics. She cut her hand, moved it to the skull, and spoke her name as the others. When a dagger flew across the ballroom, slicing through the air, landing a hair beneath Jade's bloody hand. It landed point first, embedded clean in the bull's skull, and the flames rose high. The room froze, the ranger recoiled. A voice rang out from the crowd, confident, clear, claiming the right of blood and title. Adaxa, it declared, of Tannertown. There was a beat of silence. Then the crowd erupted and parted somewhere in the centre of the room. Adaxa Flint, known to some as Dagger Dax, held her phantom-marked hand high. Not all of them, but enough to shake the room, shouted her name again and again. Dax, Dax, Dax! The sound grew as if drawn from memory, from violence, from loyalty. The Heckfire Club stood rooted to the spot, seeing a ghost from the past. Dagger Dax was back, and she had entered the tourney. The announcer, caught somewhere between protocol and performance, didn't register what had just happened. The weight of the dagger's throw, the invocation of Adaxa, none of it landed for him. He simply smiled, nodded stiffly, and moved on with the ceremony. But the reaction from Thaddeus Flint told a different story. He didn't flinch when the name was spoken, he didn't glance at the crowd, he didn't even blink. He went pale, stone still. His eyes locked with the figure who'd stepped forward, the figure who had once walked the city as his daughter. Zora caught the chief comptroller across the stage, and Zirath saw it too. For just a breath, the man's face cracked, an unmistakable flash of surprise. Not fear, not dismay. Just that rarest thing in the world of power, the unexpected. Then, as quickly as it came, it vanished beneath the polished stillness of hardened neutrality. Daggerdack stood at the edge of the platform, not moving toward the skull, not backing away. She met her father's gaze with open defiance. Chin high, shoulders square. There was no smile, no spectacle, just the unspoken challenge that passed between them like drawn steel. The crowd hadn't noticed the shift. They were still roaring, chanting, cheering her name. It was apparent to the adventurers that to them, she was the city's own, fierce, radiant, returned. A champion, a myth reborn. The prodigal heir of Tannertown. But Thaddeus Flint didn't raise a hand, didn't offer a word. He turned and walked off stage. The announcer blinked, looked left, then right, then fumbled with his scroll as the crowd began to notice Flint's departure. He stammered something about intermissions and protocol, and then hastily called for Amadeus von Halen to give us a rousing melody. Strings burst to life, the tempo surged, and the ballroom swept itself back into motion. The magic of the celebration reasserted itself, and dancers surged toward the stage with fresh excitement. Dax was quickly surrounded. Hands reached out for hers, admirers and allies alike offering their congratulations, their loyalty. For Tannertown, she had returned not as a rebel or a threat, but something akin to royalty, their defiant, blooded princess. The rest of the party lingered at the edge of it all, but Zora stood apart. His gaze didn't waver. He watched Dax, the light catching on her blade, the pride in her stance. Inside, something churned, rage, relief, disbelief. But it didn't stop there. Something else clawed up alongside it, and he didn't dare name it. The ballroom was still alive with celebration. Von Halen's strings rang from the rafters, dancers spun in drunken circles, and more than a few noble patrons were attempting cartwheels with mixed results. But the adventurers had seen enough for one night. The blood oaths were sealed. The stage had been set. Tomorrow at dawn, the tourney would begin. 16 champions, 3 rounds, and 1 victor. A purse of 20,000 gold awaited, to be claimed before a roaring crowd of 50,000 drawn from every edge of the province. But Zora heard none of that. His mind had gone somewhere else entirely. Daggerdax, alive, walking, breathing, Flint's daughter, that Dax, the rogue who'd left him stunned in the middle of a cursed shrine in the Darkwood, with a smile and a half-truth for a goodbye. Now she was standing on stage, a contender in the tourney, and maybe, just maybe, his opponent come sunrise. Zora's mouth hadn't closed since she threw that dagger. His friends, recognizing the signs of complete emotional overload, gently decided not to let him spiral on the ballroom floor. Thomas and Celia flanked him, subtly guiding him toward the grand doors and the quieter halls beyond. Zora allowed himself to be moved, but didn't stop turning back to the stage, as if expecting her to vanish again. Still staring at the spot where she'd stood, he said, deadpan and distant, that Dax was alive. Thomas didn't miss a step. Celia didn't even blink. "That's right, friend," they said in unison, like parents calmly confirming the existence of a monster under the bed. And Zora's brain, still short-circuiting, would need the night to catch up. Friz asked Zirath what was wrong with Zora, puzzled about the display. Zirath, dismayed at his barbarian companion, simply offered that only the gods knew what was wrong with him. The party made their way back through the winding halls of the Velvet Fang. The energy from the ballroom still echoed in the halls behind them, music muffled, voices blurred, but their path took them away from the noise toward their familiar rooms. Somewhere along the walk, with the corridors quieter and their steps slowing, a thought settled over a few of them. Celia, Zora, and Zirath each turned their palms upward and stared at the backs of their hands. There, etched in a faint black char, the image remained. A bull's skull, burned in appearance, though they'd felt no pain when it had appeared. Friz studied it as best she could. Her brows furrowed and pages turned, but all she could conclude was that it resembled a kind of oath magic, old, foundational, akin to what druids or paladins might swear. But this felt older, wilder. Tied not to gods, but something rooted in place and blood and history. Zora, however, barely noticed, still drifting, still trapped somewhere between a cursed forest, a thrown dagger, and the impossible return of Dagger Dax. Thomas, never one to let momentum slip, offered a few ideas for how they might gain an edge in the coming rounds. Perhaps enchantments, perhaps interference, maybe a trick of illusion, or a whispered name to the right ears. Zirath shut it down before the second idea left his mouth. He reminded them that oaths, especially those etched into flesh, meant something. His voice was steady, measured. The three of them had entered the tourney willingly. They would win or fall by blade strength and skill, nothing else. That quieted the group. Paladins, they supposed, knew almost more than anyone about oath magic. They reached their suites. The silver valets, newly upgraded constructs from Tinborough, stood posted at doors, stairwells and intersections, humming faintly and turning their heads with eerie precision. Security was no longer a formality. Whatever was brewing in Tannertown had stirred the higher powers into action. The bank, the ranchers, the floods of coin, and that prophecy of gold and silver chains. None of it felt disconnected now. Inside their rooms, the adventurers took a moment to settle. But sleep still came, if only from exhaustion. One by one, the rooms dimmed. And as Thomas finally sank into his bedroll, eyes on the ceiling, his last thought drifted to Zirath. Of all of them, mercenaries, outcasts, scholars, wanderers, it was the stoic paladin who now lay upon a feather mattress. With everything they'd learned, Zirath's bloodline, his title, his lineage, it suddenly made a certain kind of sense why the Dragonborn preferred comfort. The fine sheets, the orderly spaces, the warm lighting and precise corners. It wasn't vanity. It was heritage. And the only one in the party who had been born a prince now wandering the world looking for answers. When morning came, the city stirred beneath a veil of anticipation, and from the moment the sun broke over the plains, Tannertown became something else entirely. The streets were alive before dawn. Vendors hauled carts into position before their shadows even hit the cobblestones. Children sprinted between wagons. Bards tuned their instruments in alleyways. Flags were raised from every window, balcony and rooftop. Red for Tinborough, white for Saffron Sands, green for Nettleport, gold for the farmlands. The banners of cities, provinces and mercenary companies snapped in the morning wind. The entire city throbbed with noise and heat and colour. The party made their way through it all, pushing toward the tourney grounds. The closer they came, the thicker the crowd grew. The plaza leading to the arena was a shifting riot of sound and movement. Rows of makeshift stands hawked fried breads, pickled fruit, and everything on a stick. Heralds shouted the odds of the first round. Nobles in tailored silks brushed shoulders with dust-covered ranchers. Someone juggled daggers just off to the side of a line of anxious gamblers. But as the champions approached, each bearing the mark of the bull, the crowd parted. Whispers turned to cheers. Some knew their names, some didn't. But they saw the cuts on the hands, the fire-lit oaths, the symbols that mattered more than faces. Zora walked tall, eyes scanning the crowd, though his heart was beating out of rhythm. Somewhere in this crush of people, Dax was also walking. Somewhere among the colours and thunder, they might meet again, but this time blade to blade. Zirath's steps were measured, calm, but the intensity in his gaze kept space around him. Few dragonkin were seen, if ever, on these shores. For some reason, children seemed the most fascinated. Celia smiled at those who called her name, mostly from wandering clerics and visitors from the spice fields. She offered quiet nods, her calm standing out in the storm. Frizz and Thomas, meanwhile, were dodging elbows, guiding their friends as far as they were allowed. When the final checkpoint came, steel gates manned by tourney attendants, they parted ways. The champions were directed into a corridor lined with banners and burning braziers. The gates groaned closed behind them, sealing them off from the crowd. Frizz and Thomas were escorted elsewhere. They were led to what the attendants politely called the next of kin seating section. reserved for loved ones, kinfolk, and representatives of the champions. It was a strange alcove near the arena floor, isolated from the nobility boxes above and the rabble stands beyond. It was empty. The champions had no next of kin, retinue, or crew. Friz and Thomas found their seats. The stone was cool. The arena roared just beyond the wall. The champions were split apart. A silent attendant led each one down a different corridor, past banners bearing the tourney's emblem, past flickering torches that guttered in the rising noise of the crowd. The air grew tighter the deeper they went. Cooler, too. Beneath the arena was a world apart. Each door bore no name, only a number, carved in clean lines. Celia stepped into hers first. A small stone chamber, empty save for a bench, a bowl of water, and a high slit in the wall where muffled noise filtered in like thunder behind a closed curtain. She turned at the last second and caught sight of someone being led to the chamber opposite hers. A slender figure in loose, dark robes, a jade mask covering their face. They were running a cloth along polished bamboo daggers. Ronin. Zora was guided to the next wing, where chambers curved along the outer wall. He entered, blinking in the dimness. His chamber was identical, bench, water, nothing more. The rumble of the crowd pressed against the thick wooden walls like a distant heartbeat. As he turned to sit, he caught a flash across the hallway in a closing door. A halfling, sun-kissed dark olive skin, hammering 2 obsidian blades with another stone, reshaping the edges. Duck, of the blasted canyons. He thought of Raylan Windstrider, and to which clan Duck might belong. Zirith's path was the longest. While walking to his chamber, he saw through a cracked door a boulder-sized dwarf. In a leather apron, his shoulders gleamed with sweat and dust, his forearms swinging like warhammers. Big Iron, the hammer of the hills, split a log with one test swing of his dagger. Not a sword, not an axe. A massive, heavy iron dagger. The log didn't even resist. Each of the 3 champions sat. Each pulled out the daggers they had selected, sharpened on the master whetstone the night before. Each checked its balance, its edge, its weight in the hand. There was no fanfare, no encouragement, just the sound of their own breath. Then the voice came. The announcer, far above in the tower, spoke through a spell that filled every corner of the arena. "Ladies and gentlemen," called the announcer from every corner of Verdun, "today you witness greatness. 16 champions will enter the sacred field." He finished, stating dramatically and theatrically that only one would stand in the end. The roar of 50,000 answered, crashing like a wave of thunder through the stone. Behind each champion, the locked door clicked once. They would hear their names when it was time. Win, yield, or die. From their lonely vantage in the next of kin section, Friz and Thomas took stock of the arena. The scale of it struck them both. 3 levels of wooden palisades and tiered bleachers wrapped in heavy canvas, ringed with banners and house flags from across the province. Winding stairs and zigzagging ramparts crisscrossed between seating tiers, reinforced with iron bracing and gilded flourishes. It was temporary architecture, but nothing about it looked cheap. Friz quietly estimated construction costs, tallying by scaffolding, materials, labour. Her conclusion, at least 43,000, maybe 50,000 strong in the crowd. And the place felt alive. Vendors barked their wares, weaving through shoulder-to-shoulder rows of spectators. Dried meats, cold wines, pastries shaped like bull's horns. Jugglers performed on ledges between breaks in the stands, and fire-breathers sent brief flares of flame that made children shriek with delight. Across the arena their eyes locked onto a private balcony, set high, shaded, and very well guarded. The grey and purple robes of Harken Bank stood alongside the branded leathers of Tannertown's guild leaders and rancher barons. All smiles, raised goblets, and murmured plans behind painted fans. On a dais just before them, in plain view, sat the chest, the prize. Gilded, reinforced, magically sealed. Inside, 20,000 gold. Friz nudged Thomas. He followed her gaze, squinting. The words came out flat. He said they looked thick as thieves. Friz agreed. She hadn't realized how tense her posture had grown, how tightly her hands were clasped in her lap. She tried to ease her shoulders, tried not to think about the fact that their party was scattered, each alone now behind stone walls and iron gates, daggers in hand. She hadn't let herself feel it until now, the chance, however small, that one of them might not walk back out. She pushed it down. The announcer's voice broke like thunder across the arena, amplified by spellcraft and carried on the roar of the crowd. The names had been drawn, the first pairing set. Drums began to beat from somewhere deep within the stands. The voice rang again, calling out for the fighters to draw their steel. The crowd erupted and the first doors opened. The drums echoed through the arena like distant thunder, and then the voice of the announcer returned, cutting through the noise with theatrical precision. The first match of the tourney had been drawn, Lucky of Cedarcrest versus Lady, Jewel of the Courts, and Pride of Inkwell. Banners unfurled from high above, catching the early morning light. The green and gold of Cedarcrest shimmered beside the deep violet and silver of Inkwell's noble houses. Trumpets blared. Names were repeated in chants that bounced through the stands, entire sections of the crowd rising and waving scarves in support. From opposite sides of the arena, the champions stepped into view. Lucky, with his trademark smirk and tilted hat, sauntered toward the circle, twirling a single dagger with relaxed ease. Lady, in stark contrast, walked with sharp precision. Her silver-lined robe swept with every step, and her daggers, ornate and gleaming, were held with the poise of someone who'd trained in ballroom and battlefield alike. They stepped into their respective rings. As was tradition, they gave a small nod, not of submission, but of acknowledgement. 2 warriors, 1 bout. In the next of kin seats, Friz and Thomas leaned forward, eyes fixed. The rules were familiar now, but the announcer reminded the crowd nonetheless. Each contestant may throw 1 or both daggers. They may dodge. They may yield. The round continues until one submits. The cheers dimmed to murmurs. The murmurs to silence. All waited. A beat passed, then Lady moved, fast and fierce. A dagger left her hand in a blur. Lucky somehow read the motion, pivoted low, and the blade sliced the air just above his shoulder. The crowd erupted. Lady, for all her poise, was now down a dagger. They reset, circling, calculating. Lady's stance shifted. Her remaining dagger caught the sun just right, and Friz spotted it immediately. The hilt's jewelled pommel threw light in at her opponent, enough to catch Lucky directly across the eyes. His step faltered. He never saw her second blade. The throw was clean, silent, perfect. The dagger struck his shoulder and sent him spinning. Friz stood up sharply before realizing she had. She sat again, blinking. Thomas glanced sideways at Friz but didn't speak. His gaze stayed fixed on the ring. Lucky tried to recover. He did. But Lady pressed the advantage. Precision throws, shallow cuts, nothing fatal. Not yet. But by the time the 4th toss was called to a halt, he was bleeding from at least 6 places, swaying slightly, his hands still up. He dropped to one knee and raised a hand. Submission. The crowd exploded, a mix of roars, whistles, and a few stunned silences. Friz, watching him get help to his feet, spoke over the din. She said what they were all thinking. 1 critical hit, and someone could die. Thomas nodded, eyes still on the ring. If he replied, Friz didn't hear it over the sound of 50,000 people crying out for more. The matches had rolled on, each one more brutal and theatrical than the last. The crowd, never full, never satisfied, roared with fevered hunger for more. Big Iron's bout against Thaddeus Flint drew gasps before the first throw. The Tinborough dwarf hurled his dagger like it was a hammerhead, the weight alone nearly knocking Flint off balance. Each throw hit the ground with force enough to shake dust from the arena floor. Another missed dagger cracked the thick wooden walls of the arena. He was pure power. But Flint never stayed still. He moved like smoke on the wind, kicking up sand as he danced from side to side, each dodge melting seamlessly into the next attack. His throws were sharp, sudden, punishing. In the end, the weight and fury of Big Iron were overmatched. He yielded, raising a fist in grim respect. Frizz nudged Thomas, he'd noticed it too. The bankers, seated high in their purple-trimmed box, only leaned forward when Flint threw. Zora's name had been called next. His opponent, Razorclaw. The barbarian strode into the arena with no flair, just focus. The blades he carried, sharpened only a day before on his master whetstone, gleamed faintly with promise. But the orc mystic didn't flinch. Razorclaw's curved tusk daggers, long and wild, spun in arcs that seemed almost alive. On a missed throw, they curved in the air like boomerangs, returning to him. If he was quick enough, he could catch one. The announcer hesitated, murmured confusion into the spell-amplified voice as he fumbled through the rules. But since they neither struck nor touched the ground, they were ruled fair. Zora held his ground as long as he could, but a moment's misstep left him open. One blade curved in just right, finding space between the ribs. The strike knocked the wind from him. He dropped to one knee, blood staining his side. He yielded. Frizz winced. She knew full well that Zora's wild magic could have turned the tide, but no spells, no enchantments, no divine aid was permitted in the tourney. Then came Celia. Blondie from Nettleport waited in the centre ring, tall, lean, covered in old scars. Her daggers were fashioned from shark teeth, serrated and wicked, each edge filed to an unnatural sharpness. Blondie gave Celia a respectful bow. They'd met her at the Drowned Lyre, where Zora had bested her at the game of drink. But this was a different sort of game, thought Celia, and she readied her stance. Frizz and Thomas barely breathed. Celia moved like a shadow. Her footwork was pristine, elegant, precise. She didn't block, she wasn't there. Her style mirrored something, and Thomas noticed it. She moved like Flint, the same tight circles, the same use of space. But Blondie's blades didn't cut, they tore. Each near miss opened flesh in jagged red lines. No killing blows, but enough to slow Celia's rhythm, enough to leave her leaking crimson as she ducked another pass. The monk never relented, and in the final round she slipped under a wild throw and planted a dagger deep into Blondie's thigh. The crowd erupted, yet the deep gashes had taken a toll. Celia couldn't stem the bleeding without her healing abilities. With her head spinning, she was forced to relent. She took a knee. From across the arena, standing in her circle, Blondie bowed in respect. Zirith was next. Ronin stood across from him, a silhouette in the rising dust. Masked, silent, and poised. The paladin moved like a duelist, but no armour, no shield, and a single blade dulled his edge. Ronin moved fast, faster than anyone so far. Midway through the second round, the monk caught Zirath's dagger mid-throw, turned and hurled it back. The crowd's gasp reached even the high seats. Zirath bled from his shoulder, but held the line for another full round. Eventually, with honour intact and blood trickling, he raised a hand. He'd lost, but not easily. On the rounds went, and more matches were called. The blade skills of each champion shone, and in the end, only 4 remained: Duck, Thaddeus, Ronin, and Dagger Dax. Then the drums sounded again. The announcer's voice returned, breath steady but voice tight. The semi-final matchups had been drawn. Frizz leaned forward. Thomas did the same. Across the arena, the chief comptroller hadn't moved. No drink, no food, no whispered conversations. Just cold focus. He was waiting, same as them, to hear the names. Everyone knew what was possible. The crowd held its breath, and then the names came. In the first semi-final round, Thaddeus Flint versus Ronin. A mix of cheers and murmurs rolled over the stands, and the tension broke like a snapped bowstring, and the arena doors groaned open on either end of the field. From one, the jade-masked assassin stepped into the light, quiet as ever. Moving like a shadow, unbothered by the sun, robes unstained, movements undiminished. Few had touched Ronin in their matches. No wounds visible, no fatigue evident. From the other, Flint emerged. The crowd cheered loud, but he didn't respond. His stare was fixed, unblinking, locked on Ronin. No wasted motion, no salute. Just the straight path forward, daggers already drawn. He looked like a man arriving to fulfill an appointment, not a fight. The banners dropped, Tannertown's flame and the emerald sigil of the southern valleys. The crowd was on its feet. They met at the circle's edge. No nods, no greetings, only stillness. Then, without signal, it began. The exchange was near incomprehensible. Steel flashed. Feet slid in practiced patterns across sand. Flint spun, his motion a blur, one dagger cutting air, while his offhand released a hidden blade, barely visible, tossed with deceptive force and speed. Ronin caught it mid-air, gasps from the stands. He didn't hesitate, turned on his heel and used Flint's own blade against him, moving to hurl it in a lightning-fast arc back across the ring. But in the instant the crowd blinked, it was over. Flint's second dagger had already found its mark, fired impossibly fast. Ronin's body seized. They staggered, eyes wide behind the mask, and then dropped, hard, onto the sand. A single blade jutted from the assassin's chest, embedded precisely between the ribs, just under the heart. A butcher's mark. The jade mask stared up, unmoving. Silence fell. No cheer, no music. Even the announcer seemed uncertain as he spoke up, his voice quieter now. Thaddeus Flint, victorious. Attendants appeared, 4 of them, rolling out a small cart without ceremony. Ronin's body was lifted and placed on it. No rites, no words, no lingering. The hired blade was wheeled off the field like spent lumber. Frizz Thomas watched in silence. There were banners overhead. The crowd had risen again, the chant of Flint's name starting low. Musicians picked up their instruments. Bright cloths waved in the wind. But beneath all of it, the truth remained. This was not theatre. It was death, real and sudden, and it was only going to get worse. The voice of the announcer continued with the matchups. Duck of the Blasted Canyons versus Adaxa of Tannertown. Dax's name rang out through the arena. The doors opened and she stepped into the sand. She walked tall, though her tunic bore streaks of dried blood from earlier rounds. Her gait was measured, blades already in hand, and she made no show of strength, just presence. The crowd responded instantly. Tannertown roared for its daughter. The chants of her name were deafening. The announcer barely finished calling her opponent before the crowd drowned him out. Duck of the Blasted Canyon stepped into the ring, his face unreadable, his frame half her height. His obsidian blades gleamed wicked in the sun, unnaturally sharp. If there were cheers for Duck, they were buried beneath the city's love for Dax. Frizz's eyes scanned the balcony. The guildmasters were watching now. The barons, the bankers, all eyes on the sand. Daggers flew. The match was fast, vicious. One obsidian blade curved low and slipped beneath Dax's guard. It embedded deep into her side. She staggered and dropped. Gasps echoed, and for a breathless moment no one moved. Then, the metallic clang of a contestant door being kicked open snapped the silence. It was Flint, daggers drawn. His face unreadable, but the fury was visible in his stride. The announcer's voice broke through the magical amplification, wavering. Champions must remain off the field until called. All participants must remain off the field. No one was listening. Not really. Flint didn't charge forward, but he stood at the edge of the ring, every muscle braced, waiting. Then a shift, movement, the crowd erupted. Dax was rising, slow, shaking, her hand planted in the sand. She drew herself to one knee. Blood streamed from her flank. With a wince, she reached to her side, gripped the obsidian dagger still embedded in her body, and pulled it free. She stood, tossed the dagger to the ground, and spat blood beside it. Then she turned and walked back into position. The crowd's roar reached a pitch that shook the timbers of the viewing balconies. Even Duck tilted his head slightly, adjusting his stance. He didn't smile or blink. They stared at one another across the ring. The silence that followed was complete. When the final daggers flew, they sliced through the silence like a bell toll. The whole arena heard the impact. Sharp. Final. Her dagger nicked the halfling's neck, and he fell to one knee, gripping the wound with both hands. His hands were empty. He'd also thrown his final dagger. Dax's body twisted at the hit. The blade had sunk into her shoulder, deep and clean. She dropped again, this time limp. A sound broke from the side of the ring. Flint's voice, raw and loud, shouted her name as he ran to her. He dropped beside her in the sand, gathering her up, calling to her. The crowd was frozen, not a whisper, just the wind, and a father cradling a daughter who had laid her blood in the dirt before her city. Frizz grabbed Thomas's arm and pointed. The dais, the private box where the barons, bankers and guildmasters had been standing, was empty. Thomas's eyes darted across the arena, the crowds, the dais, looking for something, anything. Frizz didn't wait. She pulled out the sending stones and sent a message. Something, she told her companions, was about to happen. We end our tale today with the adventurers, bloodied at the edge of the Quicksteel Tourney, seeing Thaddeus Flint holding his daughter before a silent crowd in the blood and sand of Tanner Town. Until next time, fellow adventurers.